Buenas tardes, soy la doctora Mara Gómez.
Good afternoon, my name is Dr. Mara Gomez, and I am very glad to welcome you to this first session of the plenary of the Global Network on Electoral Justice. This session is called Democratic Disaffection, and we have with us Jean-Philippe de Rosier, professor in public law of the Lille, France University. Leontine Weissing, head of sector of the advisory division of the Council of State of the Netherlands. Claudia Zavala Perez, counselor of the National Electoral Institute, Mexico. And the presidency of the session will be in charge of Chief Justice Janine Otalora Malasis, who is from the Electoral Tribunal of the Federal Judiciary. I am going to introduce once again the way in which we are going to pose the question. So please place your name tag vertically any time. Don't wait for the end of the session. If you have questions, you only have to place your name tag in a vertical position. And your questions shouldn't exceed 3 minutes. Now I am going to give the floor to the presidency of the session. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and once again, thank you for the presentation of this round table. I know that there has been a certain delay in the organization of this event, so I am going to be very brief regarding my introduction. I am only going to give two or three questions in order to start this debate that we are going to have about democratic disaffection. And I think we can spend the whole day with this topic, but I'm going to give you the questions. How do you think the discredit of the democratic institution is shown? Which are the experiences from the perspective of electoral justice in order to face precisely this crisis, this trust crisis, and this disaffection of all the institutions, and specifically for those that enforce justice? And how can we reset the communication mechanisms between the political class and the citizens, because they are already broken in many countries? Without electoral justice, whether electoral justice in your countries has suffered these experiences. And finally, if by judicializing elections, which is what we have been doing in some Latin American countries, if you have been able to create or to increase the trust levels for the institutions. I am going now to give the floor to each one of the participants so that they can mention or do some comments about this. You are going to have 7 minutes approximately, and we are going to start with Mr. Jean-Philippe de Rosier, who is a professor in public law of the Law Department of the University of Lille in France.
Muchas gracias, señora magistrada.
Thank you very much, Madam Chief. I would like to first thank the Electoral Tribunal, Mr. José Luis Vargas Valdez, for your invitation. I am very glad to be here in San Miguel Allende in Mexico. I love this country, and that's why I am very fond of coming to Mexico, and we are friends with Janine Otalora and others. along this international scenario, and I am going to speak in French.
La désaffection démocratique en France, alors que, sans prétention, nous sommes parmi les plus anciennes démocraties du monde, ou du moins la plus ancrée depuis la Révolution française de 1789. Serait inutile et trop long de faire toute l'histoire de cette désaffection, et je vais donc me concentrer sur une année électorale en particulier, celle qui vient de se passer, 2016-2017, car en France, entre le mois d'octobre 2016 et le mois de septembre 2017, en à peine un an, il y a eu 11 scrutins. 11. Peu de pays au monde, si ce n'est aucun, ne pourraient en revendiquer autant en un espace si bref. 11 scrutins, car dans un premier lieu, des primaires pour désigner des candidats aux élections présidentielles. L'élection présidentielle avait lieu en avril et il y a eu 3 primaires différentes, toutes ouvertes, donc tout électeur pouvait participer. Et les primaires à la française ont ceci de particulier qu'on peut participer à toutes. Si bien qu'un électeur pouvait aller voter à ces 3 primaires qui chacune était organisée en 2 tours, soit 6 scrutins. Puis vint l'élection présidentielle, 2 tours, les 23 avril et 7 mai dernier. Puis 5 semaines plus tard, les élections législatives pour donner la couleur de l'Assemblée nationale qui allait conduire la politique pendant les 5 ans à venir, à nouveau 2 tours, les 11 et 18 juin. Et cette année électorale se termina le 24 septembre dernier par les élections au Sénat, lequel est renouvelé par moitié tous les 3 ans. Certes, ne votent que les grands électeurs, mais c'était néanmoins une élection nationale. 11 tours de scrutin au total, tous politiques, tous nationaux, et malgré cette forte dimension démocratique, il y a une désaffection du citoyen. Comment celle-ci se traduit-elle? D'abord par un taux d'abstention qui ne cesse de croître. Alors je sais qu'au regard de certains pays, notre taux d'abstention, qui selon les canons français paraît relativement élevé, paraîtrait assez faible. À l'élection présidentielle de 2017, il y avait un taux d'abstention de 22,23% au premier tour et de 25,44% au second tour. Mais c'est néanmoins dans l'histoire constitutionnelle française, en tout cas celle de la Ve République qui a vu le jour en 1958, le taux d'abstention le plus élevé que l'on ait jamais connu. Et il a cette particularité en 2017 d'avoir cru...
highest abstentionism rate that we have had ever. And in 2017, it was increased between the first election and the runoff. So this is incredible because typical this is all the way around. Now, regarding the legislative elections, this is the first time that our constitutional elections that less than one voter out of every 2 went to vote. In the runoffs, there was an abstentionism of 57%. The second element is the drop of the memberships of the parties. The political parties have less and less members every year. Only 2 political parties, and we can say that they would claim that they have more than 200,000 members, 5 more than 100,000, and the electoral body in France has 47 million. This electoral list has 47 million inhabitants. And the third element is the progress of the political parties that are anti-systemic. I mean, those that are against the system. They want to fight the system, but taking advantage of the system. So they are there because of the system and because we have a system, but they don't want to have it today, and they have a specificity which is the presence of Marine Le Pen, which has a populism but also nationalism in the second in the run-ups of the presidential elections. All this, of course, is making aware the public opinion. The political parties try to reintegrate the citizen within the electoral process, and they propose specifically the system of the primary elections in order to get closer the citizens to the electoral processes. The primary elections of one of the parties, the Republican, the primaries of this year, 2016, November 2016, had a participation that was a record participation, because more than 4 million electors went to vote in order to appoint the Republican candidate for the presidential elections. Nevertheless, 4 million out of 47 million is less than 10% of the electoral list. So I think that in reality, this is not working in democracy. Which other systems can we take into consideration? Electoral justice has a paramount role, mainly since in 1958 the control of the legislative and the Senate elections was trusted not to the houses, but to an independent body, which is the Constitutional Council, which today is the equivalent of the Constitutional Court. So this body controls elections, and this, of course, consolidates the transparency of the electoral processes. But this is not enough to involve completely the citizens in this process. I think that we should find other elements that will allow the citizens, the voters, to trust more in the political class. But I think that it would be also important that the politicians will trust the citizens. But here, this link of trust seems that it's broken. Now, to consolidate this link, and this is my final comment, digitization is going to have a very important role, going to play an important role. France has a very important delay along these lines, and I think that we should have to develop a little bit more these digital tools, because these would get closer the voters and will involve them a little bit more with the political decisions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jean-Philippe de Rosier, for sharing these experiences and all the concerns that I think that are common to all the countries in the different continents. Increase of abstention is a problem, but it is really concerning to observe that what the Professor de Rosier was saying is that the last legislative elections, the House of Representatives was integrated with the decision of the 50% of the population exclusively, and the population that is of age or that can vote. So these are alarming figures, and with these figures, all the policymakers and the sociologists who are involved in this arena should be concerned about the future of democracy, because we have to understand that this is the only system that can allow us to substitute and to elect those that are going to be the decision makers in the country. Now, regarding the drop in the members of the political parties, for sure you in France are a result of this phenomenon of the president-elect, which is President Macron, which is coming from a party that was not specifically a party, it was not legally constituted, and this was a phenomenon that gave lots of expectations and hope in the world, because they wanted to know if independent candidates, like for example your president is regarded in some countries, provides the expectations in order to face the third topic that Jean-Philippe is telling us, which is the political parties that are against the systems without being from the right or from the left. So I think that we can debate in order to know if there are solutions that are not extremists in order to face this disaffection in the democratic arena. Now I am going to give the floor to Leontine Weissing, who is the head of sector of the Advisory Division of the Council of State of the Netherlands. 7 minutes, please, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias. Primero que nada, a mí me gustaría decir que agradezco muchísimo y es un honor para mí que me hayan dado la oportunidad de venir a esta junta tan importante. Quiero agradecerles a los organizadores no solamente por proporcionarnos un programa tan importante e interesante, sino también por organizar toda la logística que tenemos aquí. Cuando les dije a mis colegas que iba yo a hablar acerca de la desafección democrática y de la justicia de los Países Bajos, me dijeron, ¿por qué? Y les dije, por 3 razones, y trataré de explicárselas en 7 minutos. Como pueden ver ustedes, en recientes estudios, Holanda es uno de los países que se ve menos afectada por la desafección democrática, menos que los países que están aquí. Anteriormente era muy grande. Tuvimos elecciones parlamentarias en marzo de 2017 y aproximadamente el 80% de los votantes. Por lo tanto, es una cifra muy alta. Hubo mucha gente que estaba a favor de otras formas de gobierno. Incluso los que apoyaban los partidos que tendíamos a considerar como que estaban fuera del sistema o antisistémicos, como países liberales, de todos modos, aún así, apoyan mucho a la elección democrática y tienen una alta confianza en las instituciones gubernamentales y entre las elecciones. Y también es muy importante hacer notar que aunque nosotros tenemos un referéndum nacional, lo tuvimos el año pasado, vamos a tener otro en marzo y hay un alto porcentaje de ciudadanos en Holanda que no está a favor de implementar formas de democracia como esta. Sin embargo, nosotros hemos estado viendo estas tendencias, lo mismo que dijo mi colega francés, que ha disminuido en el número de ciudadanos que son miembros de los partidos políticos, menos del 2%, lo cual es muy bajo. Y hay
elections that vote for parties that could be considered populist parties, both on the right but also on the left side of the spectrum. And there's a very high level of volatility between elections. So the middle has lost a lot of ground to the parties on either side of the spectrum. The reasons for that are the same, I think, as in many of your countries. The financial crisis has led to cutbacks in government spending, and that affects people that are most reliant on that. There's uncertainty about the economic situation that makes people afraid, and that makes them more likely to punish the parties that are in government, because those are the only parties they can punish for making decisions that affect their lives. There's distrust towards European institutions. Citizens feel that the Netherlands have to contribute quite a lot towards countries that maybe have their financial situations less in order. And the recent refugee crisis has led to a renewed debate on the problems of immigration, coupled with fear for Islamic fundamentalism. So there is a growing nationalism and anti-global feeling in the Netherlands as well. This can lead to discrimination of minorities and distrust against the political elite, and is therefore something that we have to take very seriously. And although the trust in institutions like the judiciary in the Netherlands is still very high, there have been instances where there has been a public backlash against certain judicial decisions. We also see a politicization of the judicial system. Currently, the member of the head of the PVV, Geert Wilders, is on trial for certain speeches he made in public, and he's being prosecuted. And his rhetoric has been to attack the judges that are leading his trial, trying to set in motion a debate whether or not they are independent enough to give him a fair trial, or that there are members of the left political elite that are trying to get him out of office. What we also see is the fear of losing voters to the extreme parties has left has led to the more central parties embracing some of the political agenda of these populist parties, especially where it comes to the rhetoric on immigration and anti-terrorism measures. There has been an increased attention in the education system to democratic values, and the Parliament is really stressing to get the possibility to close schools that are feared to spread an anti-democratic rhetoric. The other reason why colleagues ask me why are you talking about electoral justice is because the Netherlands, unlike most of the other countries in the world, excludes most of the election process from judicial review. We have a very formal stance on democracy. Basically, the stance that was taken by Schumpeter, it says the elections are there to declare an outcome, but we don't have any or hardly any demands on the more internal affairs of political parties. We have very little legislation on spending of political parties. We don't have any rules on inclusion of females or other disadvantaged minorities in elections. So there has been very little for judges to review when it comes to the election process. Also, in our law, it says that the judges are not allowed to review the outcome of the elections. It's the parliament itself that decides whether elections were run free and fairly. It is one of the points that the Netherlands is most critiqued about by international organizations like ODIHR, because you can wonder if the old parliament is independent enough to approve the elections for the new parliament, or that there's always a political agenda there. However, that has been the situation up to very recently. There has been a slight movement in this sense. A couple of years ago, our Supreme Court in civil matters ruled that a very old, very Orthodox Christian party that didn't allow females to run as candidates for that party was in violation of Article 7 of the Treaty on Women's Rights, and the government should take measures to ensure that parties are respectful of this treaty. The party did change its bylaws. It's now women are now able to run for the party. Problem is, however, that women that are raised in that tradition of that party don't feel like they should run for elections because they feel that they don't have a role in political life. There has been quite a lot of critique on this ruling, not because of the Netherlands being opposed against women in parliament. We have a pretty high number, but because our election system is very open and it's very easy for parties to enter the political arena and get elected. So a lot of people said if women want more women elected in the Netherlands, they should start a women's party and get the women's party to have more women on the party list. So even though if you look at it from a first glance, there is not really a lot of democratic dissatisfaction in the Netherlands, and there's also not a really big problem with electoral justice. There are trends that we should take very seriously, because there is a slow but steady decline in these numbers, and we shouldn't wait for the situation to become as bad as it might seem in some of the other countries in the world before we take measures as a government. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Leontine Wissing, por un mensaje que nos da un poco de esperanza, porque finalmente escuchar que hay un país como Holanda
to listen that there is a country that Netherlands that they are not suffering for the democratic disaffection and the trust crisis in the institutions gives us the hope that maybe this is going to pass and be solved in those countries that are suffering.
Los cuestionamientos sobre los alcances del
Now, questions regarding the scopes of the referendum, and is worldwide, we have asked ourselves what can we submit or include in the referendum and what is not going to be included there. So some things that, for example, in the minority countries cannot be included, but in Great Britain, when they have seen this referendum that they went for the Brexit, going out of the European Union, where the decisions of the parliament that were legally voted are revoked in some manner by the citizens. Of course, it also sets out the problem that in the democratic disaffection, there are problems that are not proper from democracy. In Europe, for example, the European Union has a very, very high cost and a sentiment that at the national level they have lost a lot because they wanted to strengthen this union, the European Union, and they had the expectation to prevent the return of a Second World War at the beginning of the European Union. So these risks of a world of a world war is far and far. That's why we are observing the negative, the beneficial effects of the European Union. Thank you very much for sharing this idea of a women's party. Also in Spain, they have the creation of a women's party. In Mexico, we have progressed a lot regarding parity, first of all, because of the rulings of the Electoral Tribunal. And afterwards, thanks to these rulings, we included this parity principle in the candidates, but not in the integration of the organizations. Thank you very much once again for your message. Now, I am going to give the floor to our friend Beatriz Claudia Zavala Perez, Counselor of the National Electoral Institute, for 7 minutes. Thank you very much. I am very glad to be here with you. Thank you very much for your invitation to all the justices of the tribunal and who were in charge of this organization. We have some hope about this when we heard these comments from the countries that we have heard previously. But I have a very different context. In our country, in Mexico, the perception that public institutions are headed by corrupt officers that are not expending in the right thing in the monies are topics that explain this democratic disaffection. In a society where more than 10% of the rich people or the wealthy people earn 25 times more than the 10% of those that are poor, a difference of approximately 2,000% between one and the others, it's easy to understand why people is upset with politics and how this malaise is extending to democracy. The truth is that, moreover, the perceptions of inequality, poverty, violence, corruption, and impunity, problems that, by the way, the democracy is not going to solve. We all days, every day have grievances for these people, and this explains in a very clear manner the anger of the citizens with the political and the governing class. Now, regarding democracy, deception comes from the collective idea that elections are a mechanism which is full of tricks, trumps, and where they cheat and they expend lots of money, that it's just for the politicians to earn more or to have more money or to have more money. And at the end of the day, they are all the same. This has been all documented in the recent results of the Latino Barometro 2017. And this is a clear reflection of this anger. So this is, in a very general manner, some of the reasons of this disaffection of this issue with democracy and the perception of democracy in our country. But I would like to look forward to an immediate future that we have, and of course I'm thinking our next elections, 2018. So here, I would like to include an additional element. And this is not necessarily new, but for sure it's going to be pretty relevant given the high scope of the social rights. And Jan has also mentioned this. And I mean these misinformation strategies, all the attacks with false or fake news. It's worth mentioning that in Mexico will face its first election of the fake news era in a time where we are going to have the most complex elections in our country, and maybe the most competed ones of all our history, where all the information of Latino Barometro of 2017 shows us very clearly that our democracy is being seriously damaged. Under this situation, and not willing to see only the deterioration that we are experiencing, I would like to pose a question or maybe a challenge in order to rebuild confidence and trust, and not only in solving the problem. So the question that I'm going to pose is, do we, the citizens, know how to use democracy? It is clear that we can find several answers to this question. It is going to depend on several factors. Where, when, under which circumstances, but allow me to give you an idea. My answer is no. We don't know. The citizens don't know how to use democracy. Millions of people are using in a very limited manner these elections. We are not exercising in a full manner our political rights. This is a reality. And before this, I will suggest that an urgent measure to reduce this discomfort is to change our conversation. I mean, to go out of this vicious circle and to turn around things. When I say to turn around things, I'm not referring to go around the problem or the issue in order to hide it. No, but all the way around. I mean, to see how to face it. This is about facing the issue, to go in depth about this, and to see it with awareness and accountability, but from a broad perspective. As we all know, the change of social behavior takes time, years. Experts have told us that at least we need one generation to change this. But before the need of doing something fast enough, not to say urgently enough, and with certain destination, I could give you some messages, and I am going to refer only to two of them. One, it is paramount to develop ideas and arguments that have to be offered in a massive manner to the society in order to convey the knowledge that democracy is not only the elections, or that democracy is a mechanism to reproduce in a perverse manner the system, or that democracy is something like a supplier from which we should expect employments, jobs, better services, or a better world to live. And two, it is necessary to explain that democracy is not going to solve inequality, poverty, lack of economical growth. That democracy is for truly a mechanism to elect those that are going to represent us, but also, and in a more broader version, that democracy is an element that if we used it under the previously set out regulations, could instrument measurements, actions of citizen participation in the public arena, as well as the follow-up mechanisms and the control of the development of the public servants. Democracy is then the political, legal, and legitimate instrument that we, the citizens, have in order to exercise our sovereign power, our right to be able to participate effectively in the decision-making of our country. Hence, I think that to turn around disaffection towards democracy, and this is my basic idea, implies to make a pedagogical, educational, and communication effort which clarifies and broadcasts that democracy is not made by politicians, but it's made by all citizens. That to be a citizen is to have obligations, but also the right to be able to participate and decide on different topics in the public arena. I insist we shall communicate that democracy is more than elections, that democracy is about effective participation in the decision-making process. As you can see, this statement is very far from being an original idea. This is moreover an elemental idea. It is only a proposal of the communication that we shall convey to our country, something that may help, together with many other actions, to be able to change and transform the social context. But for this idea not to be bound to be only a speech, it is necessary to outline a plan at a short, medium, and long term, which goal is to rescue the value of politics and democracy from the empowerment of citizens. A plan which explains that the route of democracy is the collective power flowing downward from the bottom to the top of the pyramid, and those who make decisions are the citizens and not the politicians. I would like also to make reference briefly to 4 things that I think are important. The first one is that it doesn't matter who wins in the elections of 2018, but we are going to prove our democracy. There is no democracy without rules. To strengthen democracy implies to act freely, but always abiding by law and the rule of law. Otherwise, we should be fighting power with limitless, and that would be very dangerous for political and social stability of Mexico. In our next elections, we will observe undoubtedly what's the size of the commitment of each and all of the stakeholders of elections and the fight for democracy. It is paramount to address very carefully economics and politics. Money in the perception which is illegal and which is flowing to the electoral processes, and that its taxation is more and more complex every day. Everywhere in the world, we know that there is political corruption which is associated with the varied groups of interest. So we have to do something relevant about this. Number 3, here in Mexico, to present before the, to have elections in the tribunals has turned into a synonym of a conflict. And when there is a different opinion in authorities, we take it as if we are correcting the results. So I think that it is necessary to make the elections, or to take the elections to the tribunals, is not a conflict, but it is a mechanism to safeguard the political and electoral rights of all the participants in the elections. In Mexico, mistrust is a huge problem, and safeguarding institutions is very relevant, because we need to have better informed citizens and clear that respecting law is part of democracy, that electoral triumphs are those decided by citizens in the polls. But democracy also has defense mechanisms so that those that believe they have received a grievance in their rights, they can defend themselves before in the tribunals. And in the my fourth point is about fake news. Like it or not, this practice is already here, and it will continue. Manipulation of information is something that we cannot take as a joke. Public deliberation will be nurtured, amongst others, by information that is biased and rumor. That rumor would be a very important stakeholder in this part. In this era of liquid democracy, fake news represent a huge challenge due to the fact that their last intent is to create an informational chaos, not only against the democratic freedom, but it tries to alter the flow of contents through which we communicate the politicians with the citizens. Very soon, in a very near future, we are going to be witnessing a phenomenon of communication that, due to its negative consequences, should call all us to reflection. We have to be very careful, and mainly and overall, I would like to say, guidance should be the values of our democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Zavala, for your questions. You gave us food for thought regarding some items that are of paramount importance for Mexico, including, especially for next year, for next year's elections, which will be not only presidential but at different levels. You talked about the social media, which is something that specifically after the elections of our neighbor is now a big concern in all countries. What can happen when using social media? What can happen with fake news? And how trained and how well prepared are we in order to handle this matter properly? Your comments regarding the use of democracy, I think, are very timely. Just like you were saying regarding the case of Europe, about the sense and the orientation of the European Union when it was created is there because it was created by generations that lived during World War II and have in their minds the possibility of a World War III. But here in the Americas, the young generations take democracy for granted. They think it is an asset that could be eliminated. They don't know any other options that other generations that we know. And by we I mean people from other generations. And democratic elections are just one element of our democracy, but we tend to confuse democracy and democratic elections. And that will be discussed later on if the term democratic elections is not something that, I mean, both words mean the same thing. I think it was Jean-Philippe Desrosiers who said, who talked about this in this pleonasm in the rule of law. I will now open up the floor for questions, especially just for this topic, democratic disaffection. The first question is asked by Ramón Cadena from the International Commission of Jurists. Thank you. I thought I had to lift my name tag after each intervention. That's why I did it. But first, I want to ask Professor Desrosiers about the role of the media in France to promote or not promote that disaffection or to promote democracy as an opposite concept. But I think the question is valid for the lady representative from the Netherlands. And I would like to also congratulate Dr. Zavala for her presentation. I think it's a presentation with very important ideas and proposals. I would also like to add one question for you, if it's possible. Out of the 4 points that you mentioned, don't you think it would be also important to take into consideration and add a fifth item, a fifth point that has to do with the economic development model? Because the neoliberal model has impoverished the poor and enriched the wealthy. And it promotes a government of elites. That would be my third question for you. What do you think about that? Would you like to answer that question, Professor De Rosier? Well, it's difficult to answer this briefly, but I would try to do it. One of the first mechanisms to answer to this disaffection is what I have stated before, i.e., the trend of the politicians and citizens due to the primary elections. But what I didn't say before is that really the primary elections had a peak and then a misery in that electoral process, because no candidate was able to go to the runoff stage. One of them withdraw before the elections. Another one of them had one of the worst percentages in his political party, and another one had issues with justice-related matters that did not allow him to participate. It was Yannick Jadot, the Green Party, Hamon for the Socialist Party, and the Republicans, Fillon. So another element in order to answer this democratic disaffection was the En Marche phenomenon that Janine already talked about after my contribution with this En Marche phenomenon after the creation of the political party of Emmanuel Macron, who was able to win the elections. In reality, for me, it is not a problem to say so. Macron's victory is an accident. I am not denouncing it, but it is a historical accident that is due to two facts. That if one of them wouldn't have happened, Macron wouldn't have won. The first one is François Hollande leaving office to be candidate for his own succession, and the other one is François Fillon. François Fillon was the right-wing candidate who was seen as by most as the next president of France. But he had issues. He had dodgy job which was not real for her wife, and he wasn't even able to participate in the runoff. However, Emmanuel Macron was able to create a political party 1 year before the elections, and he was able not only to go to the runoff stage, but also he won that stage, and he was and is the president of France. But apart from that accident, the En Marche, the Macron phenomenon looks to be something new, but it's not new. Emmanuel Macron was able to achieve in a little bit over a year what all his predecessors did in 15 or 20 years. When François Mitterrand created the party in 1971, he did so to be president of the Republic, and he did it 10 years later. When Jean created his party in 76, he also did it to be president, and he achieved it. And when Macron created En Marche, he did it to become president of the Republic, and he did that 1 year after. And the first one that was surprised by that was himself. He never would have thought in April 2016 that he really was going to become the next president. So the creation of En Marche is not extraordinary. When there is some kind of particular item like this one, and when we see it with all these fast new mechanisms, especially in the digital era, in this En Marche movement, and the fact that for the first time a political party a movement, like it was called back then, but that mustn't fool anyone. It was a political party, not a movement. It was created by saying, okay, whoever wants to be a member, you can be a member. You don't have to pay a fee. You just fill out a form online and you become a member. So that allowed them to create a huge network throughout France. And to answer to this difficulty, that En Marche did not have a network, and very quickly they were able to create that motivation with the youth, and they were able to create a new movement that created a democratic affection. But that was not enough, because despite that, the abstentionism was quite high in presidential elections, and I hope I answered your questions. Thank you very much, Professor Jean-Philippe de Rossier. I will now give the floor to the representative from the Netherlands.
Well, thank you for your question. Here again,
Muchas gracias por su pregunta. En el pasado, el papel de los medios en Holanda no era un problema, porque tenemos unos medios de comunicación bastante antiguos y bastante independientes.
Every part of our society. However, there are some trends that I think are more generally seen worldwide that are affecting the way the media operates in promoting of democracy in elections. I think the competition that has is now there between the print media and the online media has led to less attention to the details of stories. Because online media appears so fast, they have to have headlines that make people click on them. So the stories that are mostly interested and mostly read by people are stories that have a headline that will try to get a lot of readers. So there is more of a tendency, I think, in the media not to pay a lot of attention to the details of a story and just like present a headline and then move on. That also means that it's easier for media to focus more on the person of the candidate than on the political issues, because it's a lot easier to write a story about what this person once said or what this person once did or who his or her friends are than to get the nuances of their political platform. And it also has led to a greater attention to populist candidates, because they tend to be more dramatic and extreme in their actions and their statements than the more average center party candidates. So overall, that creates a landscape where it's harder and harder for candidates and political parties to express the more detailed ways they want to achieve their ideas, and pushes them towards a focus on one-liners and statements that are really hard to make through, which can lead to disaffection of the public, because they see the statements and then they don't realize that afterwards, after we have elections and we form a coalition, it's impossible to meet all these statements. And then they say, well, we elected you, but you're not running the platform that we elected you on. So I think there's a really big role for the media to think about how are we still able to contribute to this process, not only by acting as companies that want to sell news, but also to really take their responsibility in the election process. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Leontín Wissing. Le daría la palabra a la consejera Claudia Zavala.
Gracias, magistrada.
Thank you very much, Chief Justice. I would like to answer very concretely. Without a doubt, one of the largest issues faced by democracy right now is economics, or the economy, without a doubt. Thank you very much. Counselor, I was going to say justice, but Counselor Zavala. The second question will be asked by Andrea Pisaneschi from the University of Siena. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. If in Italy, if we ask about the trust in institutions, most Italians would say that they trust Pope Francis, because he is good, but he is not a representative institution. Only 11% answer that they trust the parliament, only 6% say they trust the political parties, which are in the, let's say, the bottom of the list. Because, well, the reasons, there are several reasons, but first of all, I think that society has been fragmented because we lose the stabilizing function of the middle class. This is why the political parties, they don't really perform their function, which is to transfer particular interests into general interests. So in general, they fail in their democratic function. So the question is for Jean-Philippe. In Europe, we know well, there is no real background or history of regulating political parties for many different reasons, mainly historical reasons, vis-a-vis Latin America and other countries. Do you think that the time has come to regulate these institutions further?
Sí, muchísimas gracias, por favor, profesor.
Thank you. Please, Professor, go ahead.
Sí, gracias para la pregunta.
Thank you for your question.
Incontestablement, je suis pleinement d'accord avec cela.
Yes, without a doubt.
La France, comme l'Italie, ce n'est pas le cas de toute l'Europe, parce que par exemple en Allemagne, il y a une réglementation. Mais la France comme l'Italie n'a pas de réglementation spécifique.
But France and Italy, they don't have specific regulations for political parties. The only French regulation has to do with financing or funding political parties. Actually, this law has come here pretty late. It has been around for a while. It was voted into law in 1988, and it came into effect in 91. But it became indispensable because funding political parties, it usually comes from public funds, and public means regulation, right? And this is something I have been advocating for in France for a while. We need a political regulation in France. It doesn't have to be rigid. It has to be flexible because we have to respect the rights of the political parties, and that is acknowledged in the Constitution of France. But we need to specify the limits, the rights, the obligations, all these things that can consolidate transparency and to re-establish trust. Unfortunately, we don't have a Pope Francis in France, but we do have other institutions, quotation marks, that surprisingly consolidate the trust of the French people. And this is a global phenomenon that is of concern, because we're talking about the large corporations. Large corporations, people trust more large corporations than democratic institutions. There are global studies on this regard. This is a global phenomenon. I think it's a large concern that people, the citizens of the world, trust large corporations more than institutions that were chosen, that were elected by the citizens, or were supposed to be elected, because sometimes they didn't participate in the elections. Thank you very much, Professor de Rosier. Now we will give the floor to Dr. Julio Olivo from the Supreme Electoral Tribunal of El Salvador. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to congratulate the organizers of the event for all your help. I would also like to thank Dr. Zavala for that those reflections and ideas that you have shared with us. Also, the representative from the Netherlands for that important reflection. Maybe based on my inspiration on that theoretical reflections, I would like to, if you will allow me, to make some comments to see if you agree. Some of them are questions and some of them are comments. Maybe saying that democracy, and I was saying this yesterday, if we think that democracy is just some kind of machine to organize elections and the institutions, then of course it will only be useful to elect authorities that rule our countries or that rule our planet. But if democracy is conceived as something more comprehensive, as some kind of model to do things the right way, it should be at least a means to solve some social problems, the biggest social problems in our countries. Otherwise, it would be kind of useless. For instance, poverty, inequality, the rights of the people to live in a high quality of life. And something that was mentioned by the professor from France regarding businesses or corporations. I think that we often want to remove the political phenomenon from democracy or government systems or the models of power. We want to extract them from a social and economic context, and we cannot do that. Otherwise, we will get lost. You just talked about the corporations, and the representative from that university said that he doesn't really understand why companies or corporations are more trustworthy in the opinion of the citizens than politicians or even electoral bodies or tribunals. But in our countries, electoral tribunals, or the ones that hold elections, we are not trusted much by the citizens. We are close to the approval rating of politicians. So in this social, economical, and legal environment that is that we live in, we have to take that into account. I just published a book on the sunset of the companies, because corporations rule the world now, based on the New World Order, starting from the 1990s, the fall of the socialist bloc, the Soviet Union. There's just one world order where pretty much corporations handle budgets. Let's say just one company. Microsoft has a budget of about $70 billion, which is higher than the GDP of all of Central America, and we could also add the economies of Bolivia or Argentina, and that's just one company that is wealthier than all those countries combined. So maybe it would be time to reconceptualize democracy and politics and other terms, or to say, okay, which model can help us to solve these social problems? Because if it's not democracy, maybe there's something else. So we would have to rethink that. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Julio Olivo. If you agree, Councillor Claudia Zavala will begin, and then Professor De Rosier will follow. Thank you very much, Chief Justice. I think that part of the democracy is linked to an ideal that we all want to reach, and this is a state of equality for all. But this is not a problem that will be solved by democracy. I do not think that, because there are many other factors, and one of the problems that is faced by democracy has to do with these aspects, with the economy. But democracy, from my standpoint, democracy will not solve it. We need a more comprehensive and inclusive vision in order to solve those problems. Thank you, Councillor Zavala. Professor De Rosier, please go ahead.
Merci pour votre interpellation. Je ne suis pas certain de
Thank you very much for your question and your comments. I'm not very sure if I will be able to give a concise answer to your question. I myself am very surprised by what's going on. And I think that what happens is that the connection, the trust connection or the trust link between the voters and the elected is weakened. It's a weak link, and sometimes it's even broken. Why? Because those elected, they don't even trust the ones who voted for them. And you talked about democracy being reduced to elections, and I think that democracy cannot be reduced to only elections. Democracy has to do also with other mechanisms, and I have written about that. I cannot mention them all right now, but we have information, the participation of the voters when making a decision, and the representatives, the rulers, the elected want to avoid this. They want to focus just on elections every 4, 5, or 6 years. Oftentimes, shorter periods of time. In the US, they have elections every 2 years. But they say, oh no, oh my God, please let us not get closer to the voters, because what if they make decisions that we cannot control? And while the rulers and the representatives of the institutions don't trust the voters, how do you want the voters to trust the ones they elected or the candidates? Now, regarding the second point you mentioned, I would like to say that there's a study on the trust index of the French people. You were talking about the trust index in your country. In our country, in France, the institutional council, the institutional board is in charge of these things. We don't have a specialized institution, but this institute is absolutely trustworthy in my mind. But it is trusted only by 5% of French people. Why just 5%? Mainly because nobody knows it exists. Even now, with the it's being known more and more, but despite that, this figure is pretty alarming, pretty low. And I think, and this is my final comment, that once again, and I'm sorry I go back to this topic, to this issue, because I'm obsessed with it, with the digital matters or online matters. It has a very important potential because it is in the daily life of all citizens, at least in France. Everyone has a smartphone. That's where they read the newspapers. That's where they get their news every day. So I think that digital matters can play an important role in restoring that link between the representatives and the voters, or the rulers and the ruled. So it can help us with electoral justice. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your presence. Would like to thank all the members of the panel, and let's thank them with a round of applause. Those who had asked questions that were not answered, you will be able to ask those questions in the following panel. But now we would like to invite you to have lunch in the patio that's right next door. But first we would like to invite you after lunch to the second session of this event called Political Financing of Elections, that will begin at 3 p.m. sharp right here in this room. Thank you very much.